Did everyone get a handout or has someone they can share with close to them? There is some involvement with these, so you're going to want to study up on them, I guess. But my name is Jason Hill, and I'm a conservation biologist here at a local organization, Vermont Center for Eco Studies, and I recognize many familiar faces, and thank you for your continued support. I am your host of Suds and Science, and welcome to the Norwich Inn tonight. A special thank you to Bill Chester on his 94th birthday for being here today. Nothing says birthday wild party like Suds and Science. So thank you. After party, I hear, is going to be amazing. If you came to my Suds and Science talk in January, you know that I have a history as a biologist of working with species who are right on the brink of extinction. And I'm one of a few biologists who worked with a species of vertebrate that is now extinct. I was one of the last biologists to work with them. And we often think of these species that are rapidly declining, like monarchs have been for 30 years now, that it's inevitable that we're going to save them. And we think back to success stories, especially here in Vermont, like peregrine falcons and common loons. And we think, absolutely, we're going to figure out what's wrong, and we're going to halt this. We're just going to do X, Y, and Z. Things will be better. They'll come right back. That's I think, human nature. That's how I think about things. That's how I want to think about things, that nothing is ever really gone, that we are always right there. Of course, genetic technology like CRISPR extends the deadline for when species truly go extinct, and who knows what the next 100 years will look like for bringing species back from extinction. But we are not there yet with monarchs, and I'm sure you're going to hear all about populations of monarchs tonight. But one thing I did want to say about the monarchs or working with species that are inevitably declining and our ability to bring them back is that it's no guarantee. And I kept thinking about how to introduce our speaker tonight, Elizabeth Howard, who is the founder and director of Journey North and is here tonight to speak to you about monarch ecology and migration. I kept thinking about how to introduce our speaker tonight using the butterfly effect. And does anyone know what the butterfly effect is? Yeah. Right, it's this component of, of course, professor in the back, but it's this component of chaos theory from physics, right? This idea that the initial state of something gives rise to unpredictable and unforeseeable changes that manifest into unpredictable states down the road. And I kept thinking that is not a good analogy for tonight, because that analogy would say that we don't know what is contributing to monarch and insect population declines in general, that we don't know or have any concrete steps that we could take, that it's all just complete random Monte Carlo, throw the dice up in the air and hope for the best. If that were the case, and it was entirely random sequence of events that could determine whether monarchs are on this planet in 100 years or not, then me flashing open my Monarch t-shirt could have just saved monarchs. I doubt it. I just could have made him go extinct, couldn't I? I don't know. It isn't that. The butterfly effect is a horrible analogy, because there are definitely concrete things, and there's lots of science driving the conservation and management of monarchs. We have lots of ideas about where we need to go that are supported by hard science. And with that, I'm so happy to introduce Elizabeth Howard, tonight's speaker. Please give a big Suds and Science welcome.
Well, this is so much fun to be here. Thank you so much for the introduction. And I've always had so much respect for VCE, and it's an honor to be the featured speaker tonight and to be speaking about my favorite topic, the monarch butterfly. I brought with me for all of you a little crib sheet so that you can follow along as we go through the year with the monarch. But I first want to just start with Journey North is the foundation that I started in 1994, and we track the monarch migration to and from Mexico. And it started as an education program back in 1994 when the internet was just barely alive. And lo and behold, it turned out that the public was as interested or more interested than schools. And so we now have 70,000 sites all across Canada, the US, and Mexico. And people are reporting their observations of not just monarch butterflies, but other signs of the seasons. And that's why our project is called Journey North, because we follow the spring season's journey north with sightings of first sightings of the year. With the Monarch, I don't know how many people in here are old enough to remember this issue of the National Geographic in August '76. And this was when the world became aware that the monarch butterfly that we all know in our backyard goes all the way to Mexico. And it's now been over 40 years since this came out. I was in college at the time, and I'm sure anyone who saw this was as captivated as I was just to see this amazing thing. And this is really discovered by the first citizen science, or the first Monarch citizen science project, which was tagging. And that was what led the people from the north to realize that this is where our monarchs go. And so now what's happening is that you've heard a little bit about the population of monarchs, and I wanted to kind of bring with me, this is the report card for monarchs. And once a year, down in Mexico, the scientists go and visit the 12 winter sanctuaries. And you can't count individual butterflies, so they go around and they go around the colony. You've seen obviously what these colonies look like, where the butterflies all pile together really tightly. And they go around and they measure the area of each of the 12 sites, and then they get together and add it up. And this year, it was great news to see that there were 15 acres of monarchs. And we haven't had this many monarchs since 12 years ago. And if you look at the graph here, you can see that things got really bad 5 years ago. We're down to only 2 acres of monarchs. And these are the butterflies that come from across our entire eastern United States and Canada. And to think that that many butterflies, or that they all only occupied that much area, is really was a crisis. And so now, this year, we figure there are about 20 million per acre. So we have about 300 million monarchs in Mexico right now. And so think of that as just about the same as the U.S. population, a little bit fewer. But all of those monarchs are in 15 acres of habitat. So it's such an astonishing feat of biology and nature that, you just can't really believe it. And so, but back when there were only 2 acres of habitat, or the population was that small, people got together, a whole group of scientists got together, and I was lucky enough to be part of it, because it was one of the most amazing experiences to be sitting in a room with population ecologists and all different types of the quants that knew the numbers, and the biologists that knew the biology through and through, and to really say, what is the extinction threshold for monarchs? And to kind of think, oh my gosh, I can't believe we're really talking about this. And that was back when there were only 2 acres of butterflies. And so to see them today at 15 acres is so exciting. But the target for recovery is to have an sustained average of 15 acres. So where we are today is where we would like to be always. And you can see when you look at this graph that insects aren't like other populations. They have a lot of ups and downs. That's their natural fluctuations. And so think of it like, how high do you want to fly a plane? You don't want to be flying a plane that's going to go down and crash at the 2 level. You want to be up at the 15, they figure, so that you've got resiliency built in, so that the population can sustain itself over time. So that's the big picture of what we're hoping will happen. So now imagine that you're the scientists, and you've got to figure out what's been causing this downward trend. I mean, you look at this trend, and you've got the ups and downs, which make it really confusing to figure out, but you can see a very clear downward trend over the last decade and such. So here's the annual cycle of the monarch. And the take-home message, if you learn nothing else about the annual cycle today, is that it's really complicated. And here you have a species that goes through a spring migration, which migration is always a very perilous time of an animal's life. Then it puts off 4 generations during the breeding season, undergoes another fall migration, so another perilous time, gets to Mexico, and it has to live for 5 months off the fat that it gained during its fall migration. And then it starts all over again. So where do you suppose things are happening? That's the big question. How do we model this population to understand where things are going wrong? And my friend Janet Hardy said, talk about climate change. And so I thought, all right, what we'll do instead is I'm going to have actually Nancy is going to keep track of how many times I mention the word temperature, because monarchs are affected by temperature every moment of their lives. And so when you talk about climate change, you're talking about really affecting every moment of a butterfly's life to the extent that the climate's temperature driven and changing. So we'll start right out with that, and think about the challenge of trying to figure out what's happening, and that the clue is really, one of them is temperature in terms of what's driving these populations. There's a new paper that's coming out, and it's looking at this annual cycle, and there are 177 climate variables that are being trying to tease out. So that gives you a sense of how busy Nancy's going to be during this next few minutes. But looking at why did we have so many this last summer, it was a great growing season, and you almost get into the Goldilocks principle where you say, it wasn't too hot, it wasn't too cold, it was just right. And so if you think of where was it just right, that's kind of one of the things that you have to wonder about. But back to, we'll start off at the annual cycle, we'll start at the wintering grounds. And you might wonder, well, why do they go where they go? I mean, why do they go to this part of Mexico? And it's amazing to realize that there are 12 mountaintops where they go year after year. And in those 12 sites, there's forest that is creating a microclimate that is just right. It's not too hot and it's not too cold. And the temperature, it's 10,000 feet in elevation, so it's really surprisingly cold. Harry and I were just down there in January, and you have to sleep in beds with 5 blankets. They don't have heat, and it goes down to 30 at night and then up into the 50s. So it's really surprisingly cold. And these butterflies are there, and they're basically refrigerating themselves. So their metabolism is slowed by the cold temperatures, and that enables them to maintain their fat reserves for all these months. And yes, you'll see a few drinking off of the flowers, but really they can go the whole winter without eating. And they have to, because 300 million monarchs, you would never have enough flowers to feed them. So that's pretty amazing in and of itself. But to think that this entire population goes to 12 sites, and then when you drill down a little farther, it turns out that 75% of the population is usually spread at only 3 of the sites. So they're really quite vulnerable. They're just, all these are there together in one little spot. And sure enough, there can be storms. There was a storm in 2002 that killed 80% of the population, just one storm. So you just kind of, it all just feels so fragile. And whenever you follow this animal through its life, you feel kind of like a parent who's worried about your child every step along the way. There are just so many things that can happen. But the temperatures are so cool, in fact, that the butterflies are really, I don't know if I should really use the word paralyzed, but it's sort of how it is. They're immobilized. They can't fly unless their flight muscles are 55 degrees, so that when you see them up in those clusters, they're really quite, they're kind of just hanging on there, and they don't hibernate, but there they are. But when it's warm, then they're active. And this winter, lo and behold, it was warm temperatures. And it was so warm that the butterflies were as active in January as they should be in March. And so when we visited, we were there, and it was unbelievable. It was like standing in a snow globe, but they were just all around and moving, and you couldn't imagine anything more beautiful. And then in the back of your mind, you're thinking, they shouldn't be flying like this right now. This is the time when they're conserving their energy and or their fat reserves. And so that's been a worry, and sure enough, they left early. They've already left. They took off a lot. There's some that are still there, but they began to leave at the end of February, which is a good 3 weeks early. So you kind of think, okay, this whole thing is you know, they're abandoning the sites. They're running out of gas, and it's basically there's a lot of mortality in the winter naturally from running out of fuel, and so you know that this is an issue. So basically, here they come now, and the spring migration is starting, and at our project we're tracking the migration as the butterflies are leaving, and already getting sightings in northern Mexico. So you know, then the question is, all of these things are so carefully timed that the question becomes, what about the milkweed? And will the milkweed be ready when the monarchs get to Texas? And so these are all these balancing acts that are going on. And when we're tracking the first sightings, we're watching this wave that comes up from Mexico and then spreads across from Texas and further north. And by watching that, we can get a sense of, these are just for first sightings, get a sense of how quickly they're moving north, which routes they're taking, and really where are they, what's the critical habitat in the spring for laying their eggs. Because what happens is, if you go back to your little annual cycle wheel here, you'll see that they're laying eggs in the south. So the butterflies that we will ultimately see here in Vermont will be the children of the ones that overwintered in Mexico. But the ones, so our butterflies essentially that we're going to see, we're going to be relying on habitat that's to our south that will provide enough that the next generation will come here. And what's so dramatic about spring migration is that it's just this race against time, because as soon as the monarchs mate, they have, the biological clock is basically ticking, and they only have a few weeks left to live. So that all those 300 million monarchs that are living, breathing little things will all be dead about the time Earth Day rolls around. And I always like to think of that because it's such a vivid example of how dependent we are on our Earth and our habitat, and to think that if there's not good habitat on Earth Day to our south, we won't see monarchs in 2 months. I mean, it's that kind of vivid to realize that timing. But so what's happening is the butterflies are coming up, they've mated, the females have hundreds of eggs to lay, and they'll lay ideally one per plant, and they'll just move right along at the landscape level, just laying eggs as they go. And then it takes about, you've got your little life cycle to look at, it takes about a month, depending on temperatures, before the next generation emerges. So one of the things that's been interesting to see with the first sightings data is that, again, remember, we're trying to figure out what's happening with this population. And knowing that the whole population is dead by the 1st of May tells you that you've got to know what's going on the ground with those eggs and larvae. And it turns out that the Texas is probably the most critical state for this population when they're coming north, because they're coming up in March, and we know that you don't want them to go too far north in March. They'll get to Texas and a little bit to the other Gulf states. And then it's a waiting game, because if it's a warm spring, they'll move beyond that. And if it's a cool spring, they'll stay back. And so what's surprising is that just a couple of weeks' time can make all the difference in how far they're moving based on the weather. So if it's a cold spring, they'll stay far south and they won't go as far north. So that's why looking at where they are at this first generation is really valuable. And what's fun to see in tracking the migration is that you have all these sightings, and then all of a sudden everything goes quiet. And that's when this next generation's developing. There's a really clear lag time, And then boom, out comes the first spring generation. The children are the ones from Mexico, and they flood north all the way to Canada. So by the time we see monarchs, we're seeing the children. The children will go all the way through the whole breeding range. And then when the summer's here, you'll go through, depending on how far north you are, another 2 generations at least. So that's kind of, all these generations are occurring, and it's all driven by temperature in terms of how many generations we'll see. So when you get to looking at Vermont, I was looking back at my first sightings records, and the only of 14 years, 7 of the 14 years I didn't see one until July, and I am looking all the time. So you might think, well, why did it take till July for them to get here? But the fact is, they arrive in smaller numbers, but we just don't detect them. They're so hard, there's so few of them. But you get enough sightings in the general region to be able to visualize that they're here. But we don't usually see them, and so when we see them in July, we're actually seeing the grandchildren of the ones that left Mexico. So we're already into that 3rd generation by the time July is here. And if you're like I am and you want to know exactly when you're going to see monarchs, you make yourself a little wheel like this. And when the first one comes in, let's just say the 1st of June, you can actually count the generations and get a sense, based on giving them about a month at a time, when you're going to see more. And because with each generation, the numbers increase dramatically. So you might not see any when they arrive in June, but in July, right after the 4th of July, you tend to start seeing monarchs. And then by August, you're your 3rd generation that's been here, and they're very, very numerous. So that's kind of an interesting thing. People will often say, well, why aren't I seeing monarchs this year? And it's just too early, that they'll appear later. So in terms of a warmer climate then in the summer, you might be thinking, oh, okay, well, maybe it's a good thing. We have a warmer climate, the generations will cycle through faster, and the population grows with each generation. And that's actually true. There will be shorter generations if it's warmer. But then you get into the question of, okay, but what about the milkweed? And what happens to the milkweed if it's warmer? In a warm summer, you'll see that it ages and senesces a lot earlier, so it doesn't benefit the monarchs that way. So there are all these issues of synchrony that you have to hope are going to all work together so that the population continues to expand. Another thing with climate change that is predicted is that milkweed will increase its range. So you'll have milkweed growing. Right now it sort of peters out when you get up to the Canadian border and in a lot of across the southern Canadian border. But that may expand, but then you've got a longer way to migrate. And so, all these just things that need to match up have to happen together. So you change the system in one way and you don't know the consequence. And then a third thing is that we're still trying to understand what the cues are for migration in the fall. And it appears that there are 3 things. Day length, of course, is the constant. As the day length decreases, they're sensing that. The quality of milkweed is something they cue in on, and also temperatures. So imagine what might get mixed up with a warmer fall, less milkweed, but yet the daylight signal. So all these things are operating together, so we don't really know what the consequence can be when these change. But the term for it is ecological mismatch, which is a really interesting thing to think about. All these things need to be connected. So now when fall migration starts, there never are more monarchs than in the fall. And so they head off, and when they emerge in the fall, they're in a state called reproductive diapause. And what that means is they're basically in a non-reproductive state. They're kind of like teenagers that are not going to develop anymore. This is the analogy ends there, but but they by being in diapause, the aging hormone that they have that makes their lives so short in the summer is suspended. So while in the summer they only live 2 to 6 weeks, these fall monarchs in sexual diapause are going to last up to 8 months, which is pretty amazing. And so when they head off, they're in diapause, they're on their way to Mexico, and they have got to find food the whole way to migrate, but also to build up their fat reserves so that they can survive the winter. So that's one of the things that that's kind of an unusual migration that way. You think of animals as needing food to fuel the migration, but then to also have the added need to fatten up before the winter is really a double need for food. And then what's really fun about watching the migration map, and I never tire of this, is that we're collecting these sightings in the fall, and all of a sudden, by golly, they are going to Mexico. And you can just see this population moving down, and you remember these are 4 generations removed from the ones that left last year, so you really do get this sense of, are they really going to find that place again this year? And so that's really fun to watch. And then we work with a woman in Mexico who organizes the school kids down there, and she takes them out and watches. So the kids are down there and they're watching, they've got a little graph and they've got all their 0, 0, 0, and then all of a sudden one day these little things start showing up and they've flown all that way, and so that's how we announce it to all of our participants that the monarchs are arriving. But that is a big celebration because when you look at some of the things that are happening in fall migration, they need the wind to get to Mexico. They cannot flap their way there. They have to glide with the wind. One scientist did a study and compared how far, at a certain amount of fat, how long could they glide versus how long could they flap. And it was 44 hours of flapping flight or 1,100 hours of gliding flight. So it's really, really important. And you can really watch them move with the wind. And, not to bum everybody out with another climate change thing, but one of the things that's happening with our warm falls, when you think of how warm we've had some of these Octobers where it's 70 degrees, there are a lot of south winds associated with these warm air masses. And so to be watching this, knowing these butterflies are all parked up with the south winds just blowing for week, 10 days, and that A, they have got to find nectar, and B, the warmer it is, the more they're burning through their nectar or their fat reserves because their metabolism is faster, and they're not getting anywhere. So one of the things we've watched is that even over the last 15 years, these cold fronts, and they call them in Texas these northers, that we see them just dropping down into the Midwest, but then by the end of by October, they're dropping down as low as Texas. And those are the fronts that the monarchs move on. And to be watching these weather maps and see these weak fronts that just don't come south, they're just hung up. And last fall, it was just amazing because there were so many butterflies, but they kind of vanished for a long time while they were waiting for this front. And finally they did move down quickly. But anyway, those are some of the things that they're contending with. It's also hurricane season in the fall when monarchs are migrating. And one of the values of mapping these migrations is to be able to say, well, are they affected by the hurricanes? I mean, did the hurricanes last summer or last fall of 2017 affect them? And we were able to see that no, the butterflies weren't down that far yet. So it's nice to have this help from all these citizen scientists are out there monitoring where this population is to be able to say, no, they were not affected by a hurricane this year. There have been sightings that have been reported in from England after hurricanes. We've had twice where monarchs appeared on in the Cornish coast, just the farthest west parts of England, and the way they knew for sure was that, because maybe someone released it, that there was a nighthawk that's only found in North America, where at the same time. So that was, good evidence that this butterflies had been picked up and brought all the way across the ocean. We have a picture of one. It's really just has a little rip in its wing. It's not too bad considering. But that's 3,500 miles to go to the UK across from, let's say, Maine, and from here to fly to Mexico is 2,500 miles. So, it's over water though, which is pretty concerning. But let's see. I guess I'm just going to kind of open up to questions at this point. I don't know where your interests lie or what you're wondering about.
Well, I'm interested in all the talk about their migration seems to be centered on climate change. I guess the working paradigm or theory. And but I had heard a lot about cell towers and the electromagnetic fields confusing some of these long migrators.
Oh,
Maybe not the
interesting.
butterflies, but I wondered, is that the only thing that the scientists are really looking at is temperature?
No,
Yeah.
I was maybe misled you. The probably the reasons for the ups and downs that we see, the natural cycles, are largely climate driven.
Yeah.
But the downward trend is a whole different matter, which is a milkweed issue in the Midwest.
Yeah.
And I haven't heard about towers as being an issue for
And
monarchs.
then they are for some migrating birds or something, and I thought it was monarchs. too.
Yeah, not that I've heard
Yeah,
of.
yeah.
Anybody else?
Can you speak to planting milkweed and the results of that in the Midwest and places like that? Is it effective?
Well, in the Midwest or in general?
Well, yeah, in general, I've heard that a lot of citizen scientists are saying, well, let's plant more milkweed. Are there certain variety of milkweed you plant, and is it successful for those that have tried it?
Well, in terms of the broad scale and the population level, there cannot be enough milkweed planted by the efforts. You kind of need the all boots on the ground. You need to have the roadways planted and the backyards and every square inch of farmland really is targeted for that. That meeting that I mentioned, we're looking at the need to rebuild the population, was all about where can we get these billions of stems. I think I can't remember how many stems are needed of milkweed planted. So absolutely planting milkweed is key. Backing up as to why the Midwest, at least 40% of the population that's in Mexico comes from the Corn Belt. And that's the region where the genetically modified crops have caused eradication of milkweed. And just to kind of explain this, because it's really kind of sinister when you think about it, but so and I'll just say that it's Monsanto whose product we're talking about here, but Roundup, of course, is the pesticide we all know of. And so Monsanto also happens to produce Roundup Ready seeds. And so if you want to plant corn, you get your Roundup Ready corn and seeds and you put it in the ground, and then you can spray as much Roundup as you want, because the only thing that's going to grow are your corn seeds. So it's really, it's a remarkable thing from the standpoint of growing corn, but obviously tremendously scary when you think of what we're doing to our environment that way. And it turns out that milkweed was quite abundant in cornfields, and especially on the margins. A lot of those margins now, really farmers are planting hedgerow to hedgerow. There's very little roadside habitat left. And so when you you couple the use of the land for the corn, and then add to that the fact that milkweed's eradicated quite successfully from the fields, that's really where the real crisis occurred. And when you look at that graph here, you can literally, if you get a trend line in here, it's right when all of that hit the market. So it's a very clear connection to the agricultural practices in that part of the country. So.
Yeah, I'm just interested in, you talked about citizen scientists. I'm interested in how you guys specifically organize your data gathering and your citizen science core to get your information.
We have been at it for a long time. This is our 26th year, and started out, got a really nice early start on getting people involved. I think what is a really good recruitment tool and way to maintain our volunteers is that we produce a lot of weekly migration news, and so we can really put in context what people are seeing. So, and they can report to the map and see their sighting right there. But I think what's unique about what we do, and also really keeps the volunteers involved, is that kind of two-way street where people are getting immediate results and they're seeing how what they're looking at is fitting into the big picture. So when you see your monarch or your milkweed emerges in Vermont and you appear on the map, you can send in a picture, and you can compare your records. That's part of my job, is to really put it all in context with kind of tell the story of the migration each season. But I think that's a really important way to keep people involved, is to make sure that you see how the data are being used. So, Chris.
Well, I have a couple parts to this question. One, how many monarchs are there in the world? How many of them winter in Mexico? And can you tell us about some of the conservation issues on the wintering grounds?
Sure, these softball questions. Well, one thing I want to mention that's really, you may have read in the news in terms of how many monarchs are there. Just looking at North America for a second, we have the eastern population that goes to Mexico, and we know that there are 15 acres, 300 million of them basically. So there's 300 million in the east. And then in California, there's a western population that's west of the Rockies. And that's the population that's been in the news, because it is really bad news what's happened there. In that situation, so in Mexico we have 12 wintering sites. In California, there are 220 sites, all spread across from San Francisco down to the Mexican border. And in those sites, there are only 30,000 monarchs. Not 30 acres, only 30,000 individuals, and there's so few that people actually go and count them with binoculars and are able to say. And that is a drop, this year was a drop to 30,000 from last year there were 200,000. So it's just this crash. And we've heard about the fires and California's issues with water and development and agriculture, and it's kind of all hit at once. A year ago last winter, so a year ago now, the butterflies abandoned their colonies early, and that was partly why people were predicting this would happen in Mexico, because they had a really hard winter along the California coast, and so the butterflies left and there wasn't milkweed available yet, and they think that was why this thing just took a huge crash, because they left too early, the milkweed wasn't ready, there wasn't much available nectar-wise, and so they got off to a low start and never recovered. So basically now you have 300 million monarchs in Mexico and 30,000 in California. So that's a pretty good answer. And they are around different parts of the world, just scattered, but I don't know anything about the numbers, but they're pretty much a cosmopolitan species. They're all around, but milkweed doesn't grow globally to sustain those populations. So that I don't know more about it than that. In terms of conservation in Mexico, Oh boy, it was really bad with illegal logging, maybe 5 years ago or more. The way that the land ownership in Mexico is a really interesting structure. You have it's actually private land where the sanctuaries are. So people own the land. The government doesn't own the land. This world treasure is not in ownership of any national park or anything. It's private landowners, and Mexico has the ejido structure, which is a communal ownership of the land, and so it's really a touchy situation because there's a lot of, just culturally anywhere, but also in particular I think in Mexico because of the colonial history, when the government came in and said, we want to put this land aside, a group of people burned down one of the sanctuaries. It was like, don't come in here and tell us how to manage our land. This is 25 years ago. And it goes on to this day where there's a very difficult and delicate balance between serving the needs of the local people with this international world treasure. So I think that they've stopped the logging in the core of the sanctuaries has successfully been curtailed, but the buffer areas around them are not well maintained. There's a lot of clandestine logging. There are a lot of just people that are poor who come in to get enough wood to warm their dinner at night. I mean, it's a poor part of the world, and so the conservation there is very concerning. There was a storm that hit 3 years ago, and it was a really strong winds that knocked over these gigantic fir trees, and so then it became the excuse to go into the core and get out the trees, and so there was a lot of question as to how that was done, and was it, were more trees taken than should have been, and so sadly that storm made tremendous damage on this microclimate conditions, because the canopy is really lost a lot of trees, so the microclimate is destabilized from that. So I think that's probably one of the big things, and just in general how vulnerable the butterflies are. I mean, you could have a fire, you could have any disaster that could hit. If it hits a place where 75% of the monarchs are, it doesn't take long to figure out how vulnerable they are that way. But anyway, I think that the logging is better, but I don't think by any stretch it's taken care of.
Is the milkweed the only plant that they
Yeah.
spread?
Yep, the caterpillars will only eat milkweed, and so the butterflies lay their eggs only on milkweed.
I have a question about milkweed. So you can buy in the Northeast now milkweed that's not native. I've heard that might not be a good thing because of where they think they might be.
Well, that's a really good question, and in our region, non-natives, it probably isn't that big of an issue. I mean, but it's a huge issue in the South, because what's happening is, and this is one of those things where we tend to love something to death, but people are trying to help. The easiest milkweed to grow is tropical milkweed, and it doesn't die back in the winter. And so down along the Gulf in areas where it doesn't freeze, the butterflies stay and they keep reproducing all winter, which is one thing, but then disease is building up. And so there's a particular parasite that, long name, but it's shortened to OE, and that parasite is at about 85% of the butterflies are infected when they're in a place where they're breeding year-round. And so now we have a problem on our hands because you're trying to get people to plant milkweed, but not that kind of milkweed, and people that are, well-intentioned don't want to listen to scientists because we're so expert now in our country, and so it's really a problem. And the butterflies are, not well served by it at all. Similarly, there's a lot of talk about captive rearing monarchs and releasing them, and let's raise a bunch of them. And if you want to raise them just for your own pleasure and to have a child enjoy it with you, fabulous. But don't be thinking that's a way to rescue the population for the very same reasons of concern of disease buildup. And I someday, as soon as I have time, I want to talk to the hospice, local hospice, who does those releases, because they're buying captive reared stock, and it's just the disease of risk. When you think of, we know some of the diseases, but then when you imagine the ones we might not know about, and to think that they all go to one area, it just seems like not a good idea to mess around with.
That's been bothering me for years.
Oh, let's go together. I would love to go
I've
together.
been meaning to write them or call. I did speak to one that they hadn't thought about.
I would love to do that.
Okay.
Let's do
I'll
it
find
together.
out.
That would be great, because I think we could egg each other on.
It's really worried me.
It's very worrisome, and it's happening. It's.
Matter of fact, it makes me sick to my stomach.
I know. And weddings, people release them for weddings, and it's just, it's very dangerous.
Do they know how these fourth generation monarchs know to get to Mexico? How did they get there?
That's such a good question. It's not understood how they do it.
Could you
It's
repeat
just,
it?
how do the monarchs know to get to Mexico, and how do they go to that one place? And what you do know is they have to have a sense of direction, so a compass, and they have to have a sense of place to know that they're there when they get there. So what's amazing to me is if you are in the Midwest and the monarch sanctuaries are straight south, the butterflies when you watch them migrating over, they're all going straight south. And when you're here, they're headed to the southwest. It's just, they are beelining there. So, but there are studies that are beyond my understanding about some of the genetic drivers and the way that they've looked at it, but it's not fully understood, and I don't have a really good, I'm not very proficient in understanding even what is out there about it, but I just know it's not really understood.
Probably not.
Go, Jean?
So, do the ones that come back to Bragg Hill as fourth or fifth generation, are they related to the ones that left Bragg Hill to go to Mexico?
Probably not. Probably
so
not.
how do they know where to come back then?
They're following the milkweed, actually. That's one thing the data that we've collected is showing pretty clearly, is that if the milkweed's emerging over here, they're down at the level of following it. And so the whole reason that it's thought that migration evolved, monarchs are a tropical butterfly ancestrally. And so if you picture that tiny little, how small the area of Mexico is, where even Mexico itself, and we have this huge North America that suddenly is, able to produce all this milkweed. And so historically, over evolutionary time, the butterflies kind of followed that milkweed north.
So it's like discovering America, so to speak.
Yeah, every single year.
Do you know of any other species of anything that is solely dependent on one food source?
There are quite a few it's not uncommon in butterflies. They're specialists of with pollination and with that's the beauty of the insect world. There's just so many examples. And that's one of the things I love about Monarchs, is it introduces all of us to some pretty amazing biological things that happen, and it's such an accessible story. But you could, I don't know if Kent is here, is he the butterfly expert here? We could probably rattle off a whole bunch of examples, but there are many examples.
Yeah, just to follow up on the overwintering grounds question. So, so you've been looking at this for 20 or so years, almost 30 years. So, are the monarchs, when they're aggregating in those wintering grounds, it doesn't sound like they're using like the entire habitat.
That's a really good question.
So like, has that actually decreased? I know there's logging and so forth, and is actually shrinking?
Well, that's such a good question, because what happens is you see pictures of them and they're all just clustered together, but those colonies move. All winter long they move. And that's one of the challenges of protecting the land, is that when they arrive, they're up high. It's a picture of a mountain. They're up high in the mountain. Then as the weather gets colder, the colony moves down in and gets lower and lower in the mountain. And then, because it's their dry season, water becomes scarcer and scarcer, to the point that they're drinking dew in the winter, but the dew, there's not even enough condensation. So then the colonies move into the riverbeds and follow down in these canyons. And so when you think about protecting that land, you know, and what's so interesting is when they were first even putting together these sanctuaries, and kind of in 90, I think it was 98, there were conversations that I listened to where people hadn't even been down to say this is where they are this month or this month. It wasn't even understood enough. But just anecdotally, they kind of thought, well, we need these watersheds, and the watersheds are not protected. And that's probably one of the really critical periods of the winter season, because water is so essential. So that's a really good question. So they don't use a lot of area at a time, but they move and use a lot of area that is very scarce and different in terms of what it's providing in terms of shelter. Shelter from the north wind, from rains, from freezing, from dryness, and all those things. So that's a really good question. One more thing to worry about.
Could a big, beautiful wall have any impact on us?
Does what?
A big, beautiful wall have any impact on us?
The Trump
wall.
wall. The
Oh,
Trump
wall.
Sorry.
They can go over.
You were going to ask something. Did you have?
I just had a question.
Yeah.
So milkweed is their only?
Yes.
Because I see in our park, we have a lot of milkweed, fortunately.
Couple
It grows
of,
well.
couple of 3 acres.
And,
Oh, nice.
it's not, well, but there's quite a bit. But they spend a lot of time on their coneflowers.
Well, because they nectar. So here's what's interesting, is that the caterpillars will only eat milkweed. I'm so glad you pointed that out. The caterpillars will only eat milkweed, but an adult monarch is a generalist. It will eat from all different kinds of flowers. So they're eating the plant material as caterpillars. They have chewing mouth parts, and they chomp away. And then when they're butterflies, they have the straw, and they go around and sip from different. But that's such a good point, because I can't even tell you how many times now the message has gotten out that milkweed's important, and the need for nectar and the variety of nectar is not understood. So I'm so glad you pointed that out.
They love our coneflowers.
Yeah,
They
that's a
will
really good.
spend, I watched them, took photographs of them last summer, because they would stay there for the longest time. I
Nice.
couldn't even stand long enough to watch them.
Wow, that's
It was
great.
amazing that they particularly liked those flowers, although they're around all our gardens, but
Nice.
but I thought it was amazing.
Yeah, that's great.
We do a lot of hiking, and I saw a huge abundance of them this last year. I mean, we hardly noticed them hiking before, but they were everywhere this year. Just, the
What time of year did you see them? All summer long? Or?
Later, and then clear till late
Yeah.
September we were seeing them.
Yeah, isn't that amazing?
They were
It
everywhere.
was a really good year, wasn't it,
was.
last year? And, they arrived early last spring. They were here by the, early June, and so they got a really early start on their generations. And a lot of them got here early. So I think that's one of the things we really see here.
So how do we know which kind of milkweed, and where does one get the right kind?
You don't have to worry about kind, because
Here we go.
here in Vermont we have so much common milkweed that it's everywhere. It's free. It grows willingly, and you don't have to go to a nursery and buy any fancy varieties whatsoever. So
I don't wanna buy the one that's bad in the south.
no,
but
and
even
it wouldn't
for
really
sale.
matter here because we have frozen winters. We don't have the diseases that build up are killed by frost. So that's
How late should we wait to mow?
to mow. That's a really good question. There's going to be a bell curve in terms of when they're all gone. If you want to wait till they're all gone, wait till October. If you want to be sort of cold-blooded about it, you can kind of figure, well, most of them are gone by the middle of September, and the ones that aren't probably won't make it anyway, or but because if you're pressured to mow. But the later you mow, the better. And if it's a warm fall, till there's a really long hard frost, they'll still be out there because they're especially in the year when they're abundant, they're laying eggs all over and they just grow slowly. That little chart of their life cycle, they can take 2 months to develop if it's cool. So but it's good to wait till the absolute end of the season. Then you can be sure.
Yeah, I'm guessing you're not gonna come back every year. Is there a website where it sounds like everyone's tracking it all along the way? Is it a good year, is it a bad year?
The website is called Journey North, journeynorth.org. And I actually live here in town, so I'll be around.
So do you engage citizen scientists in the counts? How does Journey North,
Yes,
bring in
yes,
people like us?
We collect first sightings. We have a very simple protocol. You go out, you see your first milkweed, you report it in. You see your first monarch, report it in. First caterpillar and first egg. So it's that simple. And journeynorth.org is the website.
And you do that. So is Journey North the main organization
Yes.
in the country? Oh, right.
Yeah.
So you have citizen scientists throughout the U.S.
Yes.
doing the first sightings.
Yes,
Got it.
exactly. Yeah. That's why I kept saying to Chris, I wish I could have my maps and pictures and show you, because the animated maps are really cool because you can just watch this whole front moving toward your backyard, and then you can practically go out and wait for them. They'll have them coming. So.
Are there other migrations you track?
We do. We track hummingbirds. Ruby-throated hummingbirds just came across the Gulf this last week, so they're on their way. And we have the first tulips. We have gardens, kids that plant tulips and watch the tulips emerge and bloom. First robin song. Really simple things so that you bring in new people that don't need a lot of skill for identification. Like me.
One more question?
Just about ecotourism in Mexico, or ways that the community there is trying to sort of enable the local communities to be engaged and hopefully profit financially in order to not do all the illicit logging. Is that happening?
It's happening. It's definitely happening, and the tourism industry is very, very busy. I think the challenge economically is it's a short season, and so people have monarchs there from 1st of November to call it the 1st of or middle of March, but most of the tourists come sort of February, March, so it's really a pretty short window. And there have been so many efforts to try to find that economic solution. And there's an organization that, I can tell you more about it, but there's some really hopeful efforts, and then also just this sort of sense that sometimes I really kind of wish that we could just say, okay, let's put this aside for humankind. Let's not try. It's just, some of it just seems like a no-brainer that this should be protected, and it's really frustrating to see the pressures that are continuing to occur, even though we know all that we know. So, but that's the main incentive for the local people is an income, and that's really, I laugh because when all of us go down to see them, we're sort of religious about monarchs. They're just so amazing, and the people there like them, but they mostly like the fact that they bring in income. And it kind of reminds me, I had a friend one time who was from France who hadn't seen squirrels, and she was just crazy about squirrels. Squirrels! And I kind of sometimes feel like that's, you know, but they definitely, it's a very, very poor part of the world. A lot of our migrant workers come from Michoacan, the state where the Monarchs go, and you run into all kinds of, almost, I think every family I know there has somebody that's in the U.S. It's just part of life.
Maybe they should fly with the Monarchs across the border to get over the wall.
Yeah, exactly.